The alarm did not come from a bomb. It came from a report. Inside a quiet federal office in Washington, analysts stared at a thick stack of papers filled with interviews, prison records, and intelligence notes. What shocked them was not proof of a hidden terror army growing behind bars. What shocked them was something else. After years of fear, millions of dollars, and endless warnings, the data showed something unexpected. Most prisoners were not becoming terrorists. Even when they were exposed to extremist ideas, most inmates walked away unchanged. That discovery shook the system. If prisons were not turning inmates into terrorists at the rate everyone feared, then what exactly was happening inside America's prison walls? And more importantly, had officials been watching the wrong signs all along? As the report moved up the chain of command, one question echoed louder than any siren. What if the real danger wasn't mass radicalization, but the few cases no one could predict? And buried deep in the data was one case that still kept federal officials awake at night. A single inmate, a single prison, and a chain of events that nearly slipped through unnoticed. The report ended its summary with a warning that felt more chilling than any headline. It said the threat was rare, but when it appeared, it could be devastating. And that was where the real story began. Years earlier, long before the report was written, American prisons were gripped by fear. After the attacks of September 11th, everything changed. The government looked at prisons not just as places of punishment, but as possible breeding grounds for extremism. Lawmakers believed that angry, lost inmates could be easy targets for radical ideas. Federal agencies began watching closely. Who inmates talked to, what books they read, which religious groups they joined. Islam, in particular, came under intense scrutiny. This created a dangerous balance problem. Prisoners had a legal right to practice religion, but officials also feared that extremists could hide behind faith to recruit followers. So the government funded research. They interviewed inmates. They tracked conversions. They studied behavior over years. One of the biggest fears was simple. A prisoner enters for a small crime. He meets a radical recruiter inside. He leaves prison ready to kill. But as researchers gathered data, the results did not match the fear. Most inmates who converted to Islam did so peacefully. Many found structure, discipline, and calm. Violence did not follow. Still, officials knew better than to relax, because rare did not mean impossible. In a federal prison in Texas, an inmate already convicted of terrorism began speaking quietly to others. He did not shout. He did not threaten. He spoke patiently about injustice, about war, about duty. Guards did not see fights. They did not see weapons. They saw conversations. This is where the research struggled. How do you measure belief? How do you prove intention? The inmate never planned an attack inside prison. Instead, he talked about the future, about what others should do when they were free. By the time investigators stepped in, several inmates had already been influenced. This case became a key example in federal studies. It showed the real problem was not mass radicalization, but quiet influence over time.
A few listeners know clear warning signs. The research teams realized something uncomfortable. If they watched too closely, they violated rights. If they watched too little, they risked missing everything. So prisons tightened controls in specific areas. They created special monitoring units. They limited communication for known extremist inmates. They trained staff to spot behavioral shifts instead of words. But the system was still guessing. The federal report admitted something rare in government language. They did not fully know how radicalization worked inside prison walls. They only knew it didn't happen the way movies showed. No mass movements, no secret armies, just slow influence hidden in plain sight. And then came the moment that made the report urgent. During a routine review, analysts found that one inmate influenced in prison had later attempted to reconnect with extremist contacts online after release. The plan failed, but it was close enough to cause panic. The researchers went back through every note, every interview. They asked the hardest question of all. If this one almost slipped through, how many others might be invisible right now? As Chapter 1 closes, the report reaches Congress, corrections leaders, and intelligence agencies. Its final message is clear. Prisons are not factories for terrorists, but the few who do radicalize may be the hardest to detect. And somewhere inside the system, another conversation may already be happening, quiet, legal, and dangerous. The first warning sign came too late. A corrections officer noticed it during a routine shift change. An inmate had been moved to a different housing unit, but 3 others quietly asked to be transferred near him within days. No fights, no threats, just paperwork requests and calm voices. To most staff, it meant nothing. To federal analysts reviewing the case months later, it meant everything. Because this was how influence moved inside prison. Not fast, not loud, slow enough to look harmless. By the time intelligence teams flagged the pattern, the inmate at the center of it had already served years inside federal custody. He followed rules, he attended religious services, he avoided trouble. On paper, he looked like a model prisoner. That was the problem. The research teams studying prisoner radicalization focused on behavior. They tracked violence, discipline reports, and gang activity. But this inmate showed none of it. He never preached hate in public. He never passed notes that broke rules. Instead, he listened. He listened to men who were angry, men who felt forgotten, men who believed the system had crushed them. Then he spoke one-on-one. Researchers later learned his method was simple. He never started with violence. He started with belonging. He talked about brotherhood, purpose, and meaning. He framed his words as guidance, not commands. This is where the federal research began to change direction. Officials realized radicalization inside prison did not look like brainwashing. It looked like mentorship. The research teams interviewed former inmates who had crossed paths with known extremists. Most said the same thing. They didn't force anything. They just talked. They made things make sense. The studies showed that most prisoners who heard extremist ideas rejected them. Some felt uncomfortable. Others reported the conversations. Many simply walked away. But a very small number leaned in. That small number became the focus of new concern. In one real case, an inmate influenced inside prison was released under supervision. He did not commit violence, but he attempted to reconnect with extremist contacts online. Federal agents intercepted the communication before it went further. No attack happened, but the attempt alone shook confidence. The research report stated clearly that this was not a failure of religion or prison policy. It was a failure of prediction. You could not easily tell who would cross that line. This forced prisons into a dangerous position. If they monitored religious conversations too closely, they risked lawsuits and public outrage. Religious freedom was protected by law. Courts had already ruled that prisons could not treat one faith as more dangerous than another. But if they ignored subtle influence, they risked missing the next threat. So prisons adjusted again. They trained officers to watch for changes in social patterns, not beliefs. Who spent time together? Who suddenly became isolated from old groups? Who gained quiet authority without formal leadership? They also changed housing assignments. Known extremist offenders were separated, not as punishment, but as prevention. This worked, but only partly, because separation created another problem. Isolation sometimes made beliefs stronger.
Researchers noted that some inmates, when isolated, doubled down on ideology. With fewer distractions, ideas became sharper, more personal, more intense.
This discovery unsettled officials. Containment alone was not enough. The federal research response shifted toward balance. Allow faith, protect rights, but intervene early when influence turned directional. Still, uncertainty remained. One senior researcher wrote that radicalization was not a straight road. It was a narrow path few walked, but once someone stepped onto it, turning back was difficult. Then came the case that pushed the research into emergency discussions. During a long-term study, analysts reviewed old interview recordings. In one tape, an inmate calmly described a conversation he had years earlier. At the time, it seemed harmless, but knowing what came later, the words sounded different. He spoke about duty after release, about unfinished work, about patience. The inmate never committed an attack, but investigators realized that if timing had been different, the outcome might have changed. That realization haunted the research team. They were not dealing with numbers anymore. They were dealing with near misses. The report's tone shifted from academic to urgent. It warned policymakers that focusing only on ideology was a mistake. The real danger came from influence combined with opportunity. Prison was only one part of the story. Release was the other. As Chapter 2 closes, the researchers finalize their findings. They agree on one hard truth. Prison radicalization is rare, but when it happens, it hides well, and it does not announce itself. Somewhere in the system, another inmate is listening, and no report can say for sure what he will do when the doors finally open. The moment the prison gates opened, the danger changed shape. Inside prison, walls controlled movement. Time was counted, conversations were monitored. Outside, none of that existed. Freedom gave choice, and choice gave risk. Federal researchers knew this was the most fragile moment, release day. One former inmate stepped into the sunlight carrying nothing but a small bag in years of quiet influence. He had never broken prison rules. He had never threatened anyone, yet his name was already flagged in federal systems. Not because of what he did, because of what he might do. Agents followed protocol. They monitored communications allowed by law. They watched patterns, not prayers. Days passed, then weeks. Nothing happened. This was the most dangerous phase, according to the research. When nothing happens, attention fades. The studies show that if radicalized behavior emerged, it often did not happen immediately. It surfaced months later, after jobs failed, after family ties broke, after old anger returned. The research team warned that patience was critical. Then came the alert, an online message, short, careful, sent to a known extremist contact overseas. It asked no questions about weapons. It made no threats. It simply said the sender was ready to listen. That single message triggered a response that moved faster than any prison lockdown. Federal agents intercepted the communication. They stepped in quietly. No arrests were announced. No headlines followed. The public never knew how close the moment was. The attempt failed. But for the researchers, this was the proof they feared. The prison had not created a terrorist, but it had allowed influence to survive long enough to reach the outside world. The final research response took shape after this incident. The report stated clearly that prisons were not the main problem. They were part of a longer chain. The real issue was transition, the moment when structure disappeared. Policies began to change. Release plans were adjusted for inmates flagged as high risk. Support systems were added, not removed. Case managers checked in. Mental health services were expanded. This surprised many people. Instead of harsher control, the research recommended stability, because instability was the real fuel. The data showed that inmates who felt watched but unsupported were more likely to seek meaning in dangerous places. Those given structure, work, and guidance were less likely to drift back toward extremist influence. The research response made one thing clear: fear-based policy did not work. Precision did.
Congress reviewed the findings. Some lawmakers were frustrated. They wanted simple answers, clear enemies, easy rules. But the research refused to lie. It showed that violent extremism inside prisons was rare,
that most inmates rejected it, that religion itself was not the threat. The threat was isolation plus influence plus opportunity. Remove one and the chain broke. The report ended with a warning that felt heavier than any statistic. The system would never be perfect. There would always be conversations no one heard, thoughts no one could measure, intentions hidden behind calm faces. But overreaction could be as dangerous as neglect. Targeting entire groups created resentment. Resentment created anger, and anger created openings extremists could exploit. This was the lesson learned the hard way. The research response did not promise safety, it promised awareness. As the former inmate's case quietly closed, analysts archived the files. Another study ended. Another threat stopped before it formed. But the final note in the report lingered. It said the greatest risk was not what prisons produced, it was what society ignored after release. As Chapter 3 ends, one truth remains unresolved. The next inmate influenced in silence may never send a message. He may never be flagged. He may never appear in a report. And when that door opens, the system will have only one chance to get it right. The final warning did not come from a prison, it came from silence. Months passed after the intercepted message. No new contact, no signs of danger. The former inmate faded from daily briefings and weekly updates. Files were moved from active to monitored. Attention shifted elsewhere. This was the moment researchers feared the most, because history showed that when nothing happens, systems relax. Federal analysts reviewed years of cases tied to prisoner radicalization. Again and again, they saw the same pattern. The loud threats were easy to stop, the quiet ones were not. Most inmates who encountered extremist ideas never acted on them. Many grew older, calmer, and tired of anger. Some even helped officials understand how influence worked inside prison. But the few who stayed quiet after release were the hardest to understand. They blended in. They worked jobs. They lived with family. They stayed invisible. The research response made one thing clear. Radicalization was not an on or off switch. It was a slow process shaped by time, emotion, and chance. In one real case reviewed by federal researchers, an inmate exposed to extremist ideas did nothing for years after release. No messages, no meetings, no violations. Then, during a personal crisis, he reached out for guidance, not to family, not to friends, to ideology.
That moment did not lead to violence. Authorities intervened early, but it confirmed what the research had warned. The danger window never fully closed. This forced a final shift in policy thinking. Instead of asking, who is radicalized, officials began asking, who is vulnerable? The research showed vulnerability mattered more than belief. Loss of a job, death in the family, social isolation. These moments created openings. The federal response focused on prevention without fear, monitoring without harassment, support without trust blindness. Some critics said it was too soft. The data said otherwise. Facilities that invested in re-entry support saw fewer warning signs, less risky contact, more cooperation. Not because inmates were afraid, but because they were grounded. The research did not excuse extremism. It stripped away the myth. Prisons were not factories of terror. They were mirrors of society's fractures. When inmates felt seen only as threats, some became exactly that. When they were seen as people capable of choice, most chose peace.
The final pages of the report were calm, but heavy. They stated that prisoner radicalization would never be eliminated completely. There would always be rare cases that defied prediction. But panic-driven policy created more risk than it removed. The greatest failure was not missing every threat. It was forgetting that most inmates did not want to become one. As the study closed, a senior researcher wrote one sentence that stayed with everyone who read it. The system must be strong enough to stop the few without breaking the many. That sentence became the heart of the Prisoner Radicalization Research Response. Not fear, not denial, balance. The last case file was sealed. The former inmate never reoffended. No attack followed. No headlines were written. But the lesson remained. Some dangers announce themselves. Others wait quietly. And the hardest part is knowing the difference. America's prisons are often blamed for creating monsters. The truth is more complicated. Most inmates leave prison changed, not radicalized. But a very small number remind us that influence can survive behind walls and follow people into freedom. The question is no longer whether prisons create extremists. The question is whether society knows what to do when silence is the only warning. Because the next story may never make the news, and by the time anyone notices, it may already be too late.